The first thing they found were the boots. They stood upright beside the sealed rails, neatly placed, leather stiff with frost that bloomed from the inside out. There were no footprints leading away, no signs of struggle, only the smell of old coal smoke hanging in the air where a man's breath should have been. The authorities said no train had run there for decades, yet every winter someone vanished near those tracks. Workers whispered about yellow windows moving through the dark, carrying passengers who never arrived and never died. This is the story of a train that does not travel through land, but through waiting itself, and why noticing it for too long means it may notice you back. The first sign was not the train, but the frost. It appeared where it should not have existed, clinging to the rails in a precise rectangular outline, as if an invisible weight had rested there long enough to teach the metal how to remember cold. Snow continued to fall around it in soft, careless sheets, untouched and unbroken, yet the steel within that shape exhaled faintly, releasing thin strands of vapor into the air. The smell rose slowly, deliberately. Old coal dust ground into grease, damp wool soaked through with human breath, and beneath it something sour and intimate that iron alone could not produce. It was the scent of long journeys and longer waiting, of bodies pressed together and time stretched thin. The frost did not sparkle. It dulled the light, swallowing reflection, turning the rails into matte gray scars across the white landscape. Men who noticed it later would struggle to explain why they stopped walking at that exact point, why their throats tightened before their minds understood what they were seeing. The rectangle was too clean, too intentional, its edges sharp as if cut with a blade. It marked absence with the confidence of something that expected to return. As the night deepened, the frost began to move. It did not spread outward like normal cold, nor did it crack or creep randomly. It slid forward along the rails in a slow, unified motion, maintaining its shape, gliding as though dragged by an unseen hand. The steel beneath responded, darkening where the frost passed, groaning faintly as if compressed by remembered weight. Snowflakes that touched the moving edge vanished instantly, absorbed without trace, leaving behind naked metal that steamed softly in protest. Far down the line, where the forest swallowed the tracks and the sky pressed low and heavy, a yellow glow pulsed once, then steadied. It was not bright. It did not cut through the dark. It lingered, tired and sickly, like light filtered through old glass stained by years of smoke. With it came a pressure in the air, subtle but insistent, flattening sound and thickening breath. The wind died without explanation, leaving the world suspended in a silence that felt deliberate. The frost accelerated slightly, its movement gaining purpose, sliding toward the distant glow with the certainty of recognition. Along its surface, hairline fractures formed and vanished, patterns too regular to be random, echoing the rhythm of wheels that were not yet visible. The rails vibrated beneath the snow, not enough to be heard, but enough to be felt through bone, a low tremor that crawled up the legs and settled behind the eyes. By the time the yellow light resolved into the suggestion of windows, the frost had already reached the point where the train should have been impossible. The steel there was intact, unbroken, and used for years, yet it welcomed the cold like an old wound reopening. The air filled with the unmistakable odor of spent fuel and human confinement, and something colder than winter itself slipped into the space, patient and expectant, as if the land had been holding its breath since the train first failed to arrive. Years earlier, in the early years of the 20th century, the passenger train departed east under a sky the color of unpolished steel. Its lamps were newly cleaned, glass wiped clear of soot, casting steady cones of light onto the platform where boots stamped and breath bloomed white. The schedule had been checked twice, then checked again, its times written in firm ink that promised order in a landscape known for swallowing it. Steam rolled from the engine in heavy, rhythmic bursts, carrying the smell of coal and hot metal that settled into clothing and hair, marking everyone nearby as part of the journey whether they boarded or not. The cars filled slowly, not with urgency, but with resignation. Clerks carrying ledgers wrapped in oilcloth took seats near the windows, already staring ahead as if the view might answer questions they had not yet asked. Soldiers settled into corners with stiff backs and heavier silence, rifles cradled like obligations rather than tools. Widows clutched small parcels and folded papers, their black coats absorbing light, their faces pale and tight with practiced endurance. Children were pressed between adults, their boots dangling, their eyes wide and reflective, absorbing the hiss of steam and the groan of metal as something alive. Letters tied with twine were stacked in canvas bags, their weight deceptive, each one carrying the pressure of waiting, of distance, of words that could not yet be read. When the whistle sounded, it cut cleanly through the cold, sharp enough to make some flinch. The train lurched forward, wheels biting into the rails with a familiar scream that echoed briefly before being swallowed by open land. The platform receded, figures shrinking into shapes, then into nothing, and the engine settled into its long, relentless rhythm. Inside the cars, breath fogged the windows, smearing the world into indistinct motion, while the walls vibrated faintly, transmitting the pulse of the machine into bone and muscle. It felt less like travel and more like submission to a force already decided. The landscape thinned quickly. Settlements became isolated structures pressed low against the earth, then disappeared altogether, replaced by trees bent permanently eastward, as if shaped by something unseen. Snow fell steadily, not in flakes but in fine grains that hissed against the windows and packed into every seam. The sky lowered as the hours passed, flattening into a uniform gray that erased depth and distance, until forward and backward seemed interchangeable. Sound changed there. The familiar clatter of wheels softened, then dulled, as though wrapped in cloth, leaving behind a muted vibration that traveled through the floor rather than the air. Beyond the last marked station, where the sign stood crooked and half-buried, the engine began to labor. Steam vented in longer, uneven breaths, and the lights flickered once, then steadied, casting shadows that stretched and recoiled along the interior walls. Snow thickened abruptly, piling against the front of the train in heavy sheets, slowing progress until motion itself felt strained. The horizon vanished entirely, leaving only the immediate, the narrow corridor of track ahead illuminated by yellow light that seemed to weaken with every meter gained. Inside the cars, time stretched. Movement slowed, not from fatigue but from a growing pressure that made even small actions feel excessive. Frost traced delicate veins along the lower edges of the windows, creeping upward despite the heat of packed bodies and the constant burn of coal. The smell inside changed subtly, layering damp wool and human breath over the metallic tang of the engine, until the air felt used, recycled, heavy with something that clung to the throat. Some passengers closed their eyes, not to sleep, but to escape the sensation of being observed by the machine that carried them. At a point that could not later be identified, the sound of the engine faltered. Not stopped, not broken, but altered, slipping into a lower register that resonated strangely within the cars. The vibration through the floor became irregular, pulsing in a way that did not match the turning of wheels. Outside, the snow fell straight down, unaffected by speed, as if the train had slowed enough to be nearly still, though the forward motion continued. The lamps dimmed again, briefly, casting the interior into a sickly half-light where faces appeared flatter, more distant, their expressions suspended. Then the world seemed to close. The sky pressed down, the snow thickened into a near-solid curtain, and the sense of forward progress dissolved into something indistinct. The rails beneath the wheels felt less like a path and more like a suggestion, guiding motion through habit rather than certainty. Those nearest the windows saw nothing beyond the glass but their own reflections layered over gray, their breath fogging and refogging the same space, trapped in repetition. When the engine finally fell silent, it did so without ceremony. No jolt marked the stop, no lurch or scream of protest. The vibration simply ceased, leaving behind an absence so complete it rang in the ears. Steam no longer vented. Heat lingered without source. The train stood motionless in a world that offered no reference for location, direction, or time. Snow continued to fall, but it made no sound upon the roof, as if even gravity had grown uncertain. Search crews were dispatched days later, following the schedule that still insisted the train should exist. They traced the line east, measuring distance by habit and memory, by the expected curve of track and the known landmarks that should have risen from the white. They found none of the signs that accompanied disaster. No derailed cars, no broken timbers, no scorched earth or scattered debris. The rails stretched ahead clean and uninterrupted, their surfaces smooth, unmarred, untouched by the passage of wheels or weight. Snow lay evenly between the ties, pristine, unbroken, as though nothing had ever disturbed it. The men stood there in the cold, staring down a line that promised continuity and delivered only denial. The train had not crashed. It had not burned. It had not frozen in place. It had simply ceased to be present, leaving behind a path that remembered nothing, a silence that refused explanation. And somewhere beyond that last marked station, beyond record and recovery, something had accepted the train whole, preserving its shape, its passengers, and its waiting, intact and unresolved, far from any destination that could be named. The sightings began long after the missing notices had yellowed, curled, and been filed away beneath newer losses that demanded fresher ink. Time softened the memory of the vanished train into rumor, then into an inconvenience, and finally into a story told only when the night was long and the cold had pressed reason thin. It was then, on the hardest winters when the sky rang like glass and the stars seemed close enough to fracture, that the train returned to awareness without returning to record. Railway workers were the first to notice it, not because they sought it, but because their routines carried them into places where the land no longer pretended to be safe. On stretches of abandoned line where switches had rusted into immobility and snow packed itself into decades of neglect, a shape would stand where nothing should have been. The engine did not announce itself. No whistle cut the air. No vibration traveled through the rail. It was simply there, occupying space with the confidence of something that had never left. Its windows glowed a tired yellow, dim and uneven, like light filtered through nicotine-stained glass. The glow did not spill outward. It clung to the frames, sickly and contained, giving the impression of eyes that had forgotten how to close. Frost feathered outward from the cars in careful patterns, tracing their outlines against the snow as though the cold itself acknowledged their presence. The metal skin of the train appeared dry and intact, untouched by rust, yet drained of warmth, absorbing light instead of reflecting it. Those who watched from a distance felt an instinctive hesitation, a tightening behind the ribs that warned against approach. It was not fear in the sudden sense, but recognition, the body responding to something it had not been designed to understand. Men reported that sound behaved strangely near the train. Footsteps lost their echo. Wind dropped away without explanation. Even breath seemed muted, exhaled vapor hanging too long before thinning, reluctant to disperse. Inside the cars, visible through the glowing windows, shapes sat upright and still. They occupied seats with perfect posture, hands folded, heads angled forward as if attending to a destination that had not yet been announced. Their outlines were too rigid for sleep, too orderly for collapse. They did not slump or lean. They did not turn. They waited. Frost traced the glass between observer and observed, distorting faces into pale ovals, features smoothed by distance and condensation until they appeared less human and more symbolic, representations of presence rather than bodies themselves. Workers who dared to draw closer described a cold unlike the Siberian winter that had shaped them since childhood. This cold did not burn the skin or numb the fingers. It slid inward, bypassing sensation, settling directly in the chest. Breathing became shallow not from pain but from intrusion, as though the air itself had grown heavier, pressing inward with deliberate intent. The smell arrived next, subtle at first, then undeniable. Spent coal ground into grease. Damp wool that had never fully dried. The faint, sour tang of human confinement. It was the odor of travel remembered too long, of heat trapped and recycled until it carried more than warmth. The train never appeared on nights of comfort. It waited for the coldest hours, when the ground cracked faintly and trees groaned under their own frozen weight. Stars overhead seemed sharper on those nights, pricking the dark with a brittle clarity that made the sky feel fragile. In that light, the yellow windows took on a bruised quality, their glow sick and exhausted, as if illumination itself had grown weary of the task. Some men claimed the train appeared closer with each sighting, though the rails themselves offered no evidence of movement. Others insisted it always stood at the same distance, no nearer and no farther, fixed relative not to geography, but to attention. Maps failed to capture it. Instruments registered nothing unusual. Compasses behaved, clocks ticked forward, yet the sensation persisted that the train occupied a layer of space slightly misaligned with the rest of the world. On one particularly severe night, frost formed beneath the boots of a signalman who lingered too long near the line. It climbed upward, not spreading across the snow but rising vertically, stiffening leather, creeping toward bone. He later reported that the cold seemed to listen, pausing when he paused, advancing only when he moved. The smell of coal thickened around him, pressing into his throat until every breath tasted of soot and damp cloth. He retreated without turning his back, aware without reason that the figures behind the glass did not need to move in order to follow. As the years passed, the sightings grew less frequent but more precise. The train was no longer a blur at the edge of vision. Its detail sharpened. Rivets stood out beneath frost. Curtains could be seen hanging stiffly inside certain cars, their fabric rigid, frozen mid-sway. In one window, a child-sized shape sat with feet not reaching the floor, boots suspended above it, unmoving. In another, a figure leaned slightly forward, chin angled down, as if listening for an announcement that would never arrive. The cold around the train altered the land subtly. Snow near the rails packed harder, forming a crust that resisted disturbance. Footprints faded faster there, collapsing inward as if erased from below. Even animals avoided the area, tracks veering away in wide arcs that suggested instinctive refusal rather than fear. Birds did not land on the cars. Wind did not rattle loose panels. The train existed in a pocket of restraint, insulated from the disorder of the world. Those who encountered it carried the experience away with them whether they wished to or not. The smell lingered in hair and clothing long after they returned to warmth. Coal smoke clung to fabric that had not been near a fire. Damp will seem to follow them into their homes, into their sleep. Dreams grew repetitive. Endless corridors. Windows glowing softly in the dark. The sensation of sitting upright for too long, spine rigid, muscles aching not from effort, but from waiting. Official explanations were drafted and discarded. Optical illusion. Exhaust from distant engines. Shared delusion born of isolation. None accounted for the consistency, the detail, the way the cold behaved differently near the train, the way the smell arrived before sight. None explained why those who saw it stopped speaking of destinations and began speaking instead of intervals, pauses, stretches of time that felt unfinished. What unsettled the workers most was not the presence of the train, but its stillness. It did not approach. It did not retreat. It did not decay. It simply remained, windows lit, passengers upright, breath held somewhere between departure and arrival. The abandoned lines were no longer abandoned in the way maps suggested. They were occupied by something patient, something unresolved, something that had learned to exist without moving forward. And on the coldest nights, when the stars cracked sharply overhead and the land seemed brittle enough to shatter, the yellow glow persisted, steady and dim, marking a place where the past had not ended, only slowed, waiting for the world to notice it again. One winter, a maintenance crew followed the rails farther than they were ordered, drawn not by duty, but by the faint yellow glow that pulsed through the blowing snow like a weak signal from another layer of the night. They told themselves it was practical curiosity, the need to confirm what had already been denied on paper, yet their boots carried them forward with a certainty that bypassed thought. The wind thinned as they advanced, not calming so much as retreating, leaving the air unnaturally still, heavy enough to press against the ears. The train revealed itself gradually, not emerging from the storm, but asserting its presence against it. Snow banked high everywhere except around the cars, where the ground lay bare and dark, exposed earth frozen into a smooth, compacted skin. It looked burned without scorch marks, altered without damage, as if heat had passed through long ago and left behind a memory the land could not release. Frost traced outward from the rails in branching patterns, delicate and precise, stopping abruptly where the untouched snow began, marking a boundary that felt enforced rather than natural. As the crew stepped closer, Frost climbed their boots from below, creeping upward with slow determination. Leather stiffened, seams tightening as if sewn smaller, and toes numbed not from cold but from pressure, a sensation of being held rather than frozen. Breath came shallow. Each inhalation carried the familiar odor of winter, but threaded through it was something older and heavier. Coal smoke ground deep into metal, damp wool that had never fully dried, and beneath it a faint, sour note that clung to the back of the throat. The smell did not drift or disperse. It hovered, localized, as though anchored to the train itself. A low vibration filled the space, subtle enough to be missed if not for the way it settled into the body. It did not come from wind, nor from any moving part of the machine. It resonated through the rails and up through bone, a steady, patient hum that suggested containment rather than motion. Tools strapped at their sides rattled faintly in response, metal answering metal, acknowledging a presence it recognized. The windows glowed steadily now, their yellow light dulled and tired, revealing the interior with unsettling clarity. Figures sat exactly as they had boarded years before, preserved not by ice, but by restraint. Their posture was immaculate, back straight, hands folded neatly in laps. Heads angled forward at uniform degrees, eyes open and fixed on a point beyond the glass. Skin appeared gray and dry, stretched thin over bone, lacking the translucence of frozen flesh. There was no frost on them, no condensation on the inside of the windows, no sign of breath. They were not asleep. They were not dead. They were waiting. Curtains hung stiffly in some cars, caught mid-fall, their fabric rigid as though time itself had thickened around them. Luggage racks were full, bags resting where they had been placed, straps unfrayed, buckles dull with age yet intact. A newspaper lay folded on one seat, its pages yellowed but legible, headlines frozen in relevance, ink unblurred. Everything suggested interruption rather than disaster. A journey paused without explanation or permission. One of the crew reached out without realizing he had decided to do so. His glove brushed the metal skin of the nearest car, and the vibration intensified, climbing his arm and settling behind his eyes. The surface was not as cold as expected. It yielded faintly under pressure, not bending but responding, as though acknowledging touch. The smell deepened, coal and wool rising sharply, and for a brief moment he felt a sensation like weight being measured, as if the train were assessing the warmth in his body, the rhythm of his breath. Inside, one figure's eyes reflected the yellow light differently, catching it at an angle that suggested depth. The gaze did not shift, yet the impression of attention pressed outward, heavy and unmistakable. The crew felt it collectively, a tightening in the chest, a shared instinct to stand straighter, to remain still. The vibration synchronized with their breathing, slowing it, guiding it into shallow, controlled rhythms that felt imposed rather than chosen. The ground beneath their feet pulsed once, subtly, enough to disturb the frost patterns without breaking them. Snow at the boundary trembled, then settled again, as if reminded of its place. No sound accompanied the movement. Silence wrapped the scene so completely that even the absence of noise felt deliberate, curated. They understood then that the train was not abandoned. It was occupied in the most complete sense of the word. It held its passengers as a structure holds its load, distributing weight evenly, preserving balance. The stillness was not decay, but maintenance. The glow was not illumination, but indication, a signal that the state of waiting continued uninterrupted. As awareness sharpened, fear arrived late and muted, filtered through something colder and more abstract. It was not the fear of harm, but of inclusion. The sense that proximity mattered, that attention had weight, that being observed here was not passive. The vibration through the rails intensified again, syncing with heartbeat, and for a fleeting instant the crew felt the temptation of stillness, the relief of posture locked and responsibility suspended. They stepped back together, boots cracking the frost boundary with effort. The vibration resisted, lingering, tugging faintly at muscle and thought. The smell clung, embedding itself into fabric and skin. Even as distance increased, the yellow windows remained steady, unblinking, recording the retreat with the same patience they applied to waiting. When the crew finally turned away, the wind returned abruptly, tearing across the open land as if released from restraint. Snow rushed in to reclaim the bare ground, covering it quickly, erasing the boundary with aggressive efficiency. The vibration faded, leaving behind a hollow sensation in the bones, like the echo of pressure after deep water. They did not speak as they walked back along the rails. Words felt inappropriate, insufficient, too loud. Behind them, unseen but unmistakably present, the train remained exactly as it was, preserving its passengers in perfect alignment, its windows glowing faintly through the storm, its waiting uninterrupted, its hunger unspoken but understood. As dawn bled weak light across the horizon, the change announced itself not through sound or motion, but through absence. The vibration that had lingered beneath bone and breath thinned, stretched, and then resolved into a silence so complete it felt structured. The yellow glow in the windows dimmed slightly, not fading, but concentrating, as though drawing itself inward. Snow that had been falling moments before hesitated in the air, suspended just long enough to be noticed, before resuming its descent with a muted softness. The train began to move without sound. Wheels turned without grinding, their rotation visible only through the subtle shift of shadow along the rails. Steam rose from the engine in pale, shapeless plumes that carried no heat, drifting upward and dispersing without warming the air. The metal did not creak. No joint complained. Motion existed without friction, as if the machine had been relieved of the burden of resistance. Ahead of the train, the rails sharpened into perfect clarity. Frost aligned itself along their length in clean, geometric lines, transforming steel into something crystalline, precise, almost idealized. The path forward looked newly formed, untouched by wear or age, reflecting the faint dawn with an unnatural purity. Behind the train, the opposite occurred. The rails dulled as the last cars passed over them, losing definition, sinking into gray anonymity before being swallowed entirely by drifting snow. What had just supported weight and motion ceased to exist with startling efficiency, as though memory itself had been erased from the land. The workers stood frozen, not by cold, but by recognition. Breath locked in their lungs, held by a pressure that had nothing to do with fear. The air around them felt thinner now, less accommodating, as if they no longer fully belonged to the same layer of reality as the moving machine. Their shadows lay oddly distorted on the snow, stretched and flattened, barely tethered to their bodies. Car by car, the train passed, each window revealing the same unbroken tableau of stillness inside. The passengers remained upright, hands folded, eyes fixed forward. No head turned, no limb shifted. Motion occurred around them, not within them, as though they were the axis around which the train revolved. Light slid across their faces and moved on, leaving expressions unchanged, preserved not by cold but by purpose. As the final car approached, the workers became aware of something else, something that had been concealed by the presence of the train itself. The rails beneath the last wheels did not extend forward into distance. They ended. Not broken, not bent, not torn from the ground, but concluding abruptly in a smooth expanse of compacted ice. The surface was flawless, pale and opaque, reflecting the weak dawn without distortion. There were no cracks, no seams, no indication that steel had ever continued beyond that point. The track did not lead onward. It resolved into nothing. When the final car passed, the revelation settled heavily. The train did not slow. It did not hesitate. Wheels rolled seamlessly from steel onto ice without sound or resistance, continuing forward as though the transition required no adjustment. The vibration beneath the workers' feet vanished entirely, leaving them adrift in a silence that felt cavernous by comparison. In that suspended moment, understanding arrived without explanation. The train was no longer traveling through Siberia. It had not been doing so for a long time. Geography had been incidental, a temporary scaffold for something that required only direction and duration. What lay ahead was not distance but interval, not space but pause. The machine moved through the gap between moments, through the thin, overlooked silence that separates one breath from the next, feeding on motion to justify its existence, feeding on warmth to remember that it was alive, feeding on attention to remain unfinished. The air grew colder as the last glow receded, not in temperature, but in character. It lost texture, thinning into something that barely registered against skin. The smell of coal and damp wool faded slowly, reluctantly, as if reluctant to relinquish its hold. When it was gone, it left behind a hollowness that made the workers acutely aware of their own breathing, their own weight, their own unfinished movements. Snow rushed in where the rails had been, burying the end of the track beneath a smooth, indifferent surface. Ice dulled, then vanished entirely, becoming indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape. The horizon widened again, returning to its familiar emptiness, offering no hint that anything had passed through moments earlier. Only the workers remained altered. Their limbs felt heavy, not with fatigue but with delay, as if their bodies were still waiting for permission to continue. Thoughts arrived slowly, dragging themselves into coherence. When they finally turned to leave, their steps felt imprecise, slightly out of sync with intention, boots landing a fraction of a second after the mind commanded them to move. Behind them, nothing remained. No glow, no vibration, no boundary of frost. The abandoned line lay buried and silent, as it had for years. Yet the absence felt curated, intentional, as though the land had been reset rather than restored. The memory of the train pressed inward, not as image but as sensation, a faint internal pressure that suggested incompletion. As they walked, each man became aware of a subtle warmth lingering at the center of his chest, not uncomfortable, not comforting, simply present. It pulsed faintly, in time with breath, a reminder that something had measured them and found them sufficient, but not suitable. The train had taken nothing physical. It had not needed to. Far beyond sight, in a place that could not be mapped or named, the train continued its silent passage. Its windows glowed steadily once more, illuminating faces that never changed, carrying passengers who remained perfectly upright as moments slid past them without accumulation. It moved not toward arrival, but away from conclusion, sustaining itself in the only way it could, by remaining forever between what had been and what was allowed to end. When authorities dismissed the reports and ordered the line sealed, they framed the decision as maintenance, as safety, as the quiet housekeeping of a vast territory that had learned to erase its own scars. Notices were posted and removed. Locks were applied to switches that no longer connected to anything. Maps were revised until the dead rails thinned into pale suggestions and then disappeared entirely. The official record closed around the incident like ice over dark water, smooth and unquestioned. The disappearances began anew soon after, quieter this time, stripped of spectacle and distance. There were no glowing windows reported, no trains seen standing where they should not. Instead, there were absences so precise they seemed deliberate. A lone inspector sent to confirm a seal did not return, his name lingering on schedules for weeks before being struck through. A night watchman assigned to a yard that no longer handled traffic failed to answer the morning call. Men who lingered too long near dead rails, who paused to listen where silence felt too organized, were simply erased. What they left behind did not resemble struggle. Boots were found upright in the snow, leather rimmed with frost that climbed higher than weather could explain. Gloves lay folded on rail ties, as if removed with care. Lanterns were discovered unbroken, their glass clear, their wicks dry, resting in places where no one could remember setting them down. The air around these remnants carried a faint but unmistakable odor of coal smoke, old and ground down, mixed with the dampness of wool that had been breathed through for too many winters. It lingered where lungs had been, pressing against the senses with the intimacy of a touch. Investigations stalled quickly. There were no tracks leading away from the sites, no signs of violence, no evidence that could be measured or photographed without losing its character. Frost patterns refused to match weather reports. Snow covered and uncovered the same ground without consistency. Instruments brought in to test the rails returned contradictory readings, their needles twitching as if unable to settle on a single present moment. Files thickened, then thinned again as pages were removed, reclassified, or lost to fires that burned too cleanly to be accidental. Those who remained close to the matter began to notice smaller changes. Time misbehaved near the sealed lines, stretching thin or compressing without warning. A walk that should have taken minutes consumed entire afternoons. Watches stopped and resumed without explanation, hands skipping forward as if embarrassed by their own hesitation. Sleep grew shallow. Dreams filled with motion that never reached destination, with forward momentum unaccompanied by arrival. People woke with the taste of cold metal in their mouths and the persistent feeling of having been observed without being seen. The land itself seemed complicit. Snow fell heavier around the abandoned corridors, burying markers and fences with exaggerated efficiency. Trees near the rails grew at subtle angles, their trunks leaning as though listening. Animals avoided the areas instinctively, paths curving wide around stretches of ground that appeared no different from any other. Even sound behaved strangely. Wind dropped away near the dead lines, leaving a pocket of unnatural quiet that pressed inward, making the absence of noise feel deliberate rather than empty. Far from any map, beyond routes that could be traced or named, the yellow windows continued to glide through the dark. They did not cast light outward so much as contain it, a tired illumination held carefully behind glass. Inside, passengers remained seated, upright and composed, their stillness absolute. They never arrived and never left. Their journey had shed all milestones except continuation. Motion sustained them. Waiting preserved them. The train carried not bodies so much as states of being, conditions locked into alignment and kept from resolving. The cost of that preservation was subtle but exacting. It was paid in warmth siphoned from the living, in attention drawn and consumed, in moments stolen from those who stood too close for too long. The train did not hunt. It did not pursue. It waited, patient and unblinking, for curiosity to slow someone's steps, for vigilance to soften into listening, for the human impulse to confirm what should be ignored. When that attention arrived, it was measured, weighed, and, if sufficient, accepted. Those taken were not mourned properly. Their absence lacked drama, lacked witnesses, lacked a shape that grief could grasp. Families received notices that dissolved under scrutiny. Colleagues remembered faces without recalling conversations. Over time, even names lost their weight, becoming placeholders for something that refused to be fully acknowledged. Memory itself seemed to collaborate, smoothing edges, erasing urgency, allowing the gaps to become part of the landscape. Yet the train endured, unfinished by design. It had no final station because it did not seek arrival. Arrival would imply release, dispersal, an end to alignment. Instead, it sought only continuation, the sustained tension of a journey that never resolved into aftermath. It moved through the pause between moments, through the thin seam where time hesitates before committing to direction. There it fed quietly, maintaining itself on what the living did not realize they were offering. Every winter, as the cold deepened and the nights stretched long enough to feel architectural, it waited. Not actively, not impatiently, but with the steady confidence of a mechanism that understood its environment. It waited for someone else to notice it breathing. For someone to feel the vibration beneath the bones and mistake it for imagination. For someone to step closer to the rails and listen to the silence long enough for it to listen back. And when that happened, when attention settled and warmth was measured and motion aligned, the yellow windows brightened slightly, just enough to be seen. The train did not announce itself. It never had. It simply continued, carrying its passengers forward through the unfinished dark, sustained by the living, indifferent to denial, endlessly patient, waiting for the next moment to pause long enough to be claimed.